Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at Haredi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast. Think again. And we are back, friends, with another episode of the Iyun Podcast. This week we explore a very interesting and underappreciated aspect of the Haredi community's relationship to Zionism, and that is the perspective of Chabad. Chabad is often perceived as sort of its own subsect within the broader Orthodox community, and yet, of course, it shares a tremendous fidelity to Diktuk HaMitzvos, and broadly speaking, shares the hashkafas of many other Torah-centered Jews, while of course diverging on particular issues and in unique cultural ways. That being said, given how prominent and flourishing this large sector of the Torah community is, I thought it would be fascinating to hear their perspective on the most pressing issues of the day relating to Zionism, of course, army conscription, and the like. And to do so, I had the great privilege of interviewing Rabbi David Eliezeri, a senior shaliach based out of Orange County, California, someone who, beyond shepherding his own flock and running a wonderful community on the West Coast, also is intimately involved in many national and even global Jewish affairs, as you will hear. He routinely interfaces with Torah leaders from various other streams, as well as the broader Jewish world at large. And he has recently released a wonderful book, a biography of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, titled Undaunted. And of course, so much attention has been paid, and justifiably so, to the Rebbe, the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, the most recent, that sometimes his predecessor, his father-in-law, has been overlooked in either academic or even popular Torah circles outside of his role as the father-in-law of the 7th Rebbe. But here, Rabbi Eliezeri gives him his full due, and in the context of that biography, expresses the Frierdiker Rebbe's approach towards Zionism, which Rabbi Eliezeri argues is entirely compatible with the last Rebbe's as well. And through that, Rabbi Eliezeri offers us a window into Chabad's perspective, again, on the issues that we have referenced. Our conversation was held while Rabbi Eliezeri was in Israel on an important visit, and you will hear just what he was doing there, while I was here in my home studio in Silver Spring, Maryland. I hope you'll enjoy this truly illuminating conversation with an absolutely inspirational figure, and I say that without hyperbole, someone who really pushed me to think about our broader responsibility as Torah Jews, Rabbi David Eliezeri. We are here with Rabbi David Eliezeri from California, and Rabbi Eliezeri is the author of a forthcoming book called Undaunted, a biography of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, which of course we'll speak about, and also a expert on the Chabad position on questions of Zionism, secular nationalism, and all of the associated juicy topics that we will be talking about today. How are you, Rabbi Eliezeri?
I'm great. I happen to be in the holy city of Jerusalem, where we're really talking about, and here I've been participating in the board meeting of the ultimate Zionist institution, the Jewish Agency for Israel.
Amazing. So we'll discuss shortly whether or not that's an irony. But
it's an interesting it's an interesting irony, to be honest with you.
But just to start out, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? I know you're in Orange County, California.
I grew up in LA and Montreal. My family moved to Israel in 1968. I spent 5.5 years in yeshiva in Israel, in Kfar Chabad, which is the Chabad town just outside of Tel Aviv. Then I went to New York, the classic story, what we call 770. Spent time in that and had a holy and sacred environment near the Rebbe, got married. Spent 8 years as a campus shliach at the University of Miami in the early years when guys were just going to campus. We're talking about the early 70s. And then after 8 years, I did the switch that many of us did in those days. I moved into community work and moved to Orange County, California, first to Anaheim and then to Yorba Linda, and built a beautiful Chabad center there, which is a 2.5 acre campus with a beautiful community and many wonderful things. And on the side, I also happen to dabble sometimes in other global Jewish issues. I serve on the board of the Jewish Agency, and I help Chabad dealing with major Jewish organizations and a little crisis management. This week, we're dealing with a hurricane in Jamaica. I always say we're in 100 countries, so we got a problem somewhere. So we deal with some of those issues.
Now, is your family going back a Chabad family? Would you back into Russia?
No, not at all. Not at all. I went to a modern Orthodox day school in Los Angeles, Hillel Hebrew Academy. I'm a proud alumnus of Hillel. And when we moved to Montreal, I was then 14 years old. Literally a half a block away was the Chabad yeshiva, and I went there, and I got very connected to the yeshiva students, and I did the famous trek to Brooklyn, where I received what friends tell me that they never saw happen before, remarkable personal attention from the Rebbe. And eventually, when they moved to Israel, I went to Chabad Yeshiva, etc. So I, so to speak, moved a little bit from the more modern Orthodox world to the Chabad world. And I'm proud of the background that I had, that I went to Hillel, which is a wonderful school in Los Angeles. And I feel uniquely blessed that I was able to personal encounter the Rebbe and have a series of interactions with him, learn from him so much, and also to attend Chabad Yeshiva, which is, I joke with people who go to Harvard, a much better education.
Especially nowadays. So do you have a lot of extended family that's still outside of the Chabad camp, so to speak?
Not really, because I just had one sister, and she's very close to Chabad, and there wasn't a lot of cousins and whatever. There were some cousins, distant cousins in England, but I am very happy that I have 22, well, actually, with the first great grandchild, 23 grandchildren. And my first grandson, just a few weeks ago, went to help his parents in San Francisco, where he has become a second generation shliach. And my other grandson, who got married a year ago, is going to move soon to Hungary, where he's going to work with young Jewish professionals. So we're going into not the second generation. I have 6 children. 3 of them are shluchim, and 3 of them are in business. We say the ones in business have to help parents. And now we're going into the third generation, where we have 2 married grandchildren, and they're continuing on that sense of spiritual responsibility and serving the Jewish people.
And how did you end up in California? You said you were in 8 years as a shliach in Miami.
Well, my wife came from California, and they wanted somebody to come to Orange County, to the Anaheim area. And we were looking to work in community. We also wanted the Jewish education nearby. There was a beautiful day school nearby. It was just the right fit.
How was the campus experience for you before that? I mean, was that common for people at the time to stay only for a short period?
Yeah, most of my comrades, most of my classmates, people like Rabbi Yisrael Darren, who was in Connecticut, Rabbi Yankee Felig. Okay, so all of us were classmates, and we all went into campus, but there wasn't the support system that exists in Chabad today. We were all, and after a while, we got a little older, the students got a little bit younger, and a new generation came in after us. Now there's training and programs and all kinds of support systems, but at that point, we were just embryonic on campus. I turned up at the University of Miami. They thought I dropped out of a UFO. Who is this guy? It was like Fiddler on the Roof. If strange kind of like a chassid is here. What are you doing here? Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, Chabad on campus is booming. They're doing a great job. It's like everybody. I was talking here to one of the senior lay leaders of the Jewish federations, and she's one of the chairmen of one of the major committees of Jewish federations in North America. And she says to me, "My son is going to Crown Heights this weekend to Begisha." She's all excited. She's going to the National Conference for Jewish Students that's being held in Brooklyn. And that's part of the norm of Jewish life. But when I came in to the game, we were the pioneers. It was a struggle. We struggled to gain credibility, to gain students. And I feel honored to be part of that, being one of those pioneering. But like many of my classmates, I think the only one that stayed through thick and thin was Rabbi Goldstein in Ann Arbor.
But it's interesting because you typically think of a shlichus appointment as kind of a one-way ticket, right? A lifelong appointment.
Right. But this was the earlier embryonic years And a lot of us made this transformation. And I thought there wasn't the support system. Some of us moved into the communities near the campuses we were. Some moved to other campuses, other areas of the country. But this was in the evolutionary period of Shlichus in the late 70s and early 80s. Right now Chabad has become much larger. When I went on as a Chabad Shliach, I think there was a few hundred of us in total. Now we have over 6,000. So that's 12,000 when you count to the rabbis and the rebbitzins. So the numbers have grown tremendously. But we were, in that generation, young, excited, idealistic, and we went on campus. But as things changed, and we have matured as an organization in many ways and learned how to support those campus rabbis as they get a little bit older. Some of them are working with alumni, some of them working with graduate students. So that transformation, which is going on.
Very interesting. I mean, the first campus shliach was at UCLA, if I'm not mistaken, right?
The first Chabad house was at UCLA, founded Rabbi Shlomo Kunin. The term Chabad house was coined by a woman called Greg Davidson, who's somebody I knew well, who came up with the term Chabad house. And the early rabbis were Rabbi Schwartz and Rabbi Stillman, Rabbi Levitansky. All three of those have passed. They were the pioneers, and they went on campus. And again, they were finding their way. And I was finding my way also when I came on campus, I think it was 1974. And to figure out how we're going to work on campus, now it's a tried and true program. But at those days, we were just, so to speak, getting started and learning the ways. And there was also the dominating force at that time on campus was Hillel. And they were like, oh boy, who are these new guys on the block? Now, Baruch Hashem, we have a great working relationship in many campuses with Hillel. We have sometimes a different perspective, a way of approaching things, but we have a strong level of cooperation. It was a whole different world. I mean, the greeting I got at the university was not so sweet and wonderful. But with the years that we've, I think, established something now at the University of Miami, if you go to the student union, there's a kosher restaurant in the student union of the University of Miami, where I used to sit in the breezeway and talk to kids.
Amazing. So going to California was kind of a bit of a homecoming, right? Because you had grown up there.
Yeah, it stands because I grew up there as a kid, so I'm comfortable in California. My wife is from California. So, in a sense, it was a sense of a homecoming. We didn't move into Los Angeles. We moved into Orange County, which is a very different place than LA. LA has a dramatic and vibrant community, and today a tremendous Orthodox, religious community. Orange County was more the people who went there were either the Jews who didn't care so much about community, or many who came there for different kinds of business opportunities in industry. And we have 70,000 Jews estimated in Orange County. Today we have 15 community Chabad centers, a day school, and 2 campus centers. So we have over 30 Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins in the county. I was one of the early ones. I was the second community Chabad house that opened. The first one was in Irvine. And we have a day school there that's been there a little bit longer. But it's still a very different kind of place than Los Angeles, where we have one kosher restaurant. And if you go on Pico Robertson, you've got 30, 40 kosher restaurants. Some of the best in the country also.
Indeed, they are. Indeed, they are. So, did you ever have any interaction with the folks over at Disneyland? Did you ever, petition to become the official rabbi of Disneyland?
We tried to do a Hanukkah menorah lighting at Disneyland. We tried to do menorah. Chabad does menorah lightings everywhere, but Disneyland never really went for it. One year, I think they allowed us to do something in downtown Disney, but we were never able to be successful in getting into Disneyland. We do one thing at the Ducks, which is the local hockey team. Every year, we do Hanukkah on the ice, but it's not owned by the same people. There's actually a Jewish owner that owns the Ducks, and we're able to do a Hanukkah celebration. But Disneyland wants to be prim and proper, and we're never able yet to crack them.
Okay, I would have thought it would have been your lifelong mission to become the official rabbi of Disneyland. I mean, come on.
Yeah, that would have been a lot of fun. But there's Fantasyland and Tomorrowland and et cetera, et cetera. But Disneyland, that area where Disneyland used to have a lot of Jews. And when I moved in, we moved into that area. But eventually we saw a demographic shift and we moved east about 11 miles, 11, 12 miles, where the Jews were moving to on top of the crest of the hills. We're in Yorba Linda, Anaheim Hills, Villa Park. These are the neighborhoods where the Jews moved to. So Disneyland, the area around Disneyland once, if you go back 40, 50 years, was a very dynamic Jewish area. Well, a lot of Jewish, not an Orthodox community, but there was a vibrant conservative synagogue there. But today things have changed in the neighborhood.
Okay, so in addition to obviously your incredible community work and institution building and all of the quote unquote normal work of a Chabad Shliach over the decades, it seems that you've also taken an interest in areas of history and call it social history and intellectual history of the movement and of its positions on various issues. Has that always been something that you've been, particularly attuned to? How did that come about?
I've always been interested in Jewish history. I've also been interested in sociology. And I've always felt that we shouldn't operate in a siloed environment. Not everybody in Chabad agree with me that 100%, but as we have grown and we have matured today, and I was sitting at the board meeting of the Jewish Agency. They were discussing about connecting small Jewish communities. And I made the comment, as the largest Jewish organization in the world, which is the reality today. And when I started off as a shliach, we were far from that. So I always felt that we had a responsibility to interact with the broader Jewish world and retain our values and our ideology, but we shouldn't live in a silo because we have a responsibility not just to influence our organizations and the people come in contact with them, but to have an impact on the whole Jewish community, even those that maybe certain times ideological differences, and to try to encourage them to have a stronger bond with Jewish tradition, with Jewish learning, with Jewish scholarship, with limud Torah, with the observance of mitzvahs. And I felt that this was an important agenda issue. And we are operating in an environment where we have a lot of interaction with all kinds of people from the very Jewish community. And if we can influence them to do a good thing, then that's a positive thing to be achieved.
Did that particular attitude ever encounter opposition? Did you ever sort of debate that internally?
Every organization has a degree of internal politics. There's all that. But I think in general, there was tremendous support for what I believed in from our people, so to speak, the powers that be in New York. And it's a balancing act because you have to retain fidelity to your own values while you're dealing with people whose values may be different than you. And this is not an easy thing to do. And, I had a very dear comrade who we lost just a few weeks ago, Rabbi Moshe Hauer, who the last 5 years was the head of the OU, and we sat together at many tables and worked together in many things. And one of the things that always struck me about Rabbi Hauer, he was a man that was rooted deeply in Torah, but he had the ability to communicate to people whose values were very different than him. And that really is the position that, I saw Rabbi Hauer live up to those ideals in such a beautiful way. And that's the principle that I have to try to do. And it's not always easy because when you're sitting when you're sitting, in a religious community and everything's black and white, everybody has the takeout food where they get the latest brand of potato kugel. Everything is very easy. But when you're dealing with people whose ideological views are very different than your own, and you have to articulate a position based on Torah, when they are looking at things in a fundamentally different way, and you can't compromise your principles because you might as well just close shop and go away. So at that point, it's a very difficult. You have to be very constantly realize who you represent and that you have to stand up ultimately at the end of the day you have to be a Shulchan Aruch Yid. You have to be based on what Shulchan Aruch says. And as a chassid, you have to ask yourself the question, because people see you as a shliach, as a representative of the Rebbe, are you representing him in an honest, true way? Or maybe you're representing sometimes your own ego, because I don't want to say that I have one, but it's really, I think, a very central question. And it's a question that I have to ask myself every single day.
Did you have any encounter? I know you're probably a good bit older, but with Rabbi Hauer back in the Montreal days, because he's a fellow Montrealer.
No, I didn't. No, no, no. I
Yeah.
was I was older than him, and he was younger than me. I did not know him then. I knew him when he came on to the OU. Before that, I had heard him, and we never met. We became very strong friends, and we became true partners.
Beautiful to hear. And yes, I grew up in Baltimore, so tremendous loss for the Jewish world as a whole. So tell me a little bit about how you got into the particular issues of the sixth Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, who in some ways is, maybe been sort of quote unquote eclipsed, in terms of the attention given in today's world.
So I wrote a book called The Secret of Chabad, which did very well, and I wanted to write another book. Now, there's a saying by Hasidim that your Hasidic birthday is the first time you go to the Rebbe. The first time I went to the Rebbe, I was like 14, 15 years old. And it was on Yud Shvat, actually the day of the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe. And those days I was in high school in Montreal, and the tradition was the kids from Montreal would come to New York. They would have a personal audience with the Rebbe, and it was always on Yud Shvat because the previous Rebbe had established the yeshiva in Montreal in 1941. When a group of 9 yeshiva students came from Shanghai as refugees, they were able to leave Shanghai in the middle, just before World War II.
I think was Rabbi Hirschsprung involved at the time?
Rabbi Hirschbaum was on the same boat. Rabbi Hirschbaum was one of the great Torah scholars of the last generation, a phenomenal Torah scholar. And he was one of the Iluyim of Yeshivas Chachma Lublin. And I remember, knowing him as a kid, I wasn't on a level that to understand such a gigantic intellect of such a great Talmid Chacham. But he came at the same time. There were 28 yeshiva students who came to Montreal in the beginning, around September of 1941. There were 9 Lubavitchers, and so they made 2 yeshivas, a Litvish yeshiva, which has evolved into a great center of Jewish learning, had a tremendous impact on Montreal, and a Lubavitch yeshiva, which each one had their unique approach, and each one made a very important contribution to Montreal. So here I was, this kid, and we went to the Rebbe the first time, and I had written the first book. And I mean, I'll share with you what happened to me when I came to the Rebbe the first time, because it was a very interesting little story. We had gone in to meet with the Rebbe privately. There was like 10 kids that went into the Rebbe. I don't really recall exactly what he said to us. But the last night I was there, I wanted to see the Rebbe one more time. I had been very enamored. But here I had come from a more modern Orthodox background. And I came into 770, the Rebbe Shul, and they were davening upstairs in what was then the small shul. Try to get in the room. The room is packed. I can't get in. Go around the back. I can't get in. So I decided I'll stand in the hallway between the Rebbe's office and the shul in front of what there is an elevator. So I figured I'll see him one more time. Anyway, the Rebbe walks out of his office, and he's crossing the hallway, and his chief secretary, chief of staff, Rabbi Chodakov, is standing holding the door. And the Rebbe walks in the shul, and I say to myself, again, I was only 14, 15 years old. Well, the door is open. I might as well go in. So I start following the Rebbe in. This is like you're breaking protocol lahavdil in Buckingham Palace. You know what I mean? And he starts closing the door on me, and people are telling me, get out. And there's a tumult. And the Rebbe turns around and sees this kid, as they say, not a Hasidic shnit. He doesn't look like a Lubavitcher. The hat is colored. There's nice hair. There's a comb in the pocket. I wasn't exactly the Hasidic look. And he motions to Rabbi Chodakov, open the door, and he motions to me to stand by his side. People who were observers in 770 over the years said they never saw the Rebbe do that in 40 years. And I stood by, he never said a word to me at that moment, but it was like he saw this kid who didn't fit in, and he says, I want you to stand next to me. It was a very touching moment. Anyway, so Yud Shvat was always something special to me. And a few years ago, I was at an event, the National Jewish Retreat, and I was talking to a friend of mine, Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson, who's a tremendous author in his own right. And he says to me, David, somebody's got to write a book on the Frierdiker Rebbe and the previous Rebbe. I said, Mendel, I wanted to do it, but it's going to cost a lot of money in research, and I've already made a book plan. So another individual is standing by the side, and he says, Chabad, I'm very involved with Chabad, a donor, a successful businessman, who I happen to know also. And he looks at us, he says, that's not a problem. And he funded the research for the book. So I felt this was a phenomenal divine providence. I had always been enamored by the previous Rebbe's life. I grew up in yeshiva in Israel, surrounded by his Hasidim. And there's a saying by Hasidim, 2 years in Siberia, 2 years in Siberia, that's a mitzvah. 10 years in Siberia, 10 years in Siberia is a hidden mitzvah. It's a beautiful mitzvah. I grew up with these people that the previous Rebbe had sent out to fight, keep Judaism alive in Russia. Each one of them went to Siberia for a while. One of our most important teachers was Rabbi Mendel Futafas, who spent 9 years in Siberia. I was surrounded by these Hasidim of the previous Rebbe who were willing to put their lives on the line. I was always enamored by his personality. And here, Divine Providence, the guy says, okay, I'll take care of the research. And we did tremendous research on this book. So I felt this was a sign from above. Divine Providence, I should write the book. I spent 4 years of my life working on it, day and night. It's 540 pages, 1,645 footnotes, and it's a very honest biography. And what's unique is because the previous Rebbe writes about so much about his life, is what's different than all these other biographies that come out about great rabbinical scholars, Gedolei Yisrael, is that we have a window into his inner world because he writes about his inner world. And that's something which is remarkable.
Tell me briefly about the research process. How did you go? Was it just you? Did you have a team of people working with you?
No, I hired researchers because there was first thing we had to go through. I had a series of interviews from the first book with some older Hasidim that helped me. GEM, which is one of the great resources, the treasures of the Chabad community, Jewish Educational Media, has done over 4,000 interviews to do with the Rebbe, but they produced for me 1,400 pages of transcripts that people that had interaction with the previous Rebbe. I sent people into the archives of the JDC. I was able, I don't want to go into how, but The Russian National Library has in its possession many letters that the previous Rebbe wrote his wife during his visit in America in 1929, 1930. He was here for 1 year. So, as they say in Yiddish, unter the Tisch, in a quiet way, I was able to get some of those letters. I was able to get a treasure house of 600 letters written by the Rebbe's secretary in the 1930s, which are a true window into what's going on in the Rebbe's world, his personal secretary. And then there's a tremendous amount of material which has been published in recent years in the Chabad community. There's been, books, and we have 17 volumes of the previous Rebbe's letters. We have almost 6,000 letters that have been published. His talks, many other memoirs from people, individuals, Hasidim, that are producing memoirs about the Chabad world. So all of that material, I had to go through it. But when you go through 6,000 letters, you discover such a wealth of information. And because the previous Rebbe was so self-revelatory, and there's also diaries that he wrote. So all of that material together, you have to take it. And then one of the decisions I made going in is I'm not going to limit myself to the Chabad community. I went into all other kinds of historians. I wanted to get the background from other perspectives. I wanted to get the historical context. I'm not just interested in what they're telling you the story from the Chabad point of view, because we have wonderful history, a tradition of history in the Chabad community. But there is also beyond that many other historians who may look at the world quite differently, and we need to understand their view of history, and putting it all together in a book and a narrative that's readable was a challenging thing to do. So I hired researchers, went into archives, snuck a little bit of letters out of the Russian National Library, got hold of all kinds of other different kinds of documents, and the writings of the previous Rebbe himself are one of the greatest treasures of all.
Give me a kind of a high level, just brief biographical sketch of the Frierdiker, and then I want to transition into our primary topic, which is of course his approach and Chabad in general's approach to Zionism and so forth. But just briefly sketch us the life of the Frierdiker Rebbe.
So I'm going to give you a sketch. He's born in 1880. His father is the Rebbe, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Shalom Dober, who we call in the parlance of Chassidim. Every Rebbe has a shortened name. He was called the Rebbe Rashab. He was a tremendous scholar of Chassidic philosophy. The Rebbe gets married at 15 years of age. His father, the Rebbe Rashab, brings him in the town of Lubavitch to the grave of his predecessors, and he says, "You are now going to enter community work, and you're going to spend your life on my right hand." At 15 years old, he becomes an asken, a community activist on behalf of the Jews of Russia. And he has to confront the anti-Semitism of the Tsarist regime, and he's lobbying in Holland and Germany to get them to cut off, do financial restrictions, like we would call, what's the term which is used, to stop money being lent to the Russian government unless you stop the pogroms. And then communism comes in. And I think one of the most remarkable stories in the book of all is what his father, just 2.5 weeks before he passed away, he calls in his son. The fifth Rebbe calls in his son, who's going to be his successor. And he's at this point, the fifth Rebbe is healthy. And they're right now living in the town of Rostov because they had run away from Lubavitch because of the German invasion. And he tells him 3 things. He says to him, number one, the communist government will eventually fall because a government which is dedicated to destroying Torah and Judaism will not last. It will take at least 22 years, but it's going to disintegrate. So he says communism will fall apart. He doesn't tell him exactly how long. He gives him at least a minimum. And we see what happened. The communists disintegrated. Number 2, he tells him that Lenin's going to have a strange death. In 1922, he dies he gets a stroke, he gets a this, he gets a that. He tells them that Stalin is going to navigate the leadership of the country. He's going to dress himself up with all kinds of military honors. How does Stalin come to meet Roosevelt and Truman as the Marshal of the Soviet Union? And Trotsky, he tells him, wird dem vertreiben und verpatrieren. They're going to exile him and murder him. This is an open prophecy. And he tells his son that Reshev Yitzchak, you're going to have to put your life on the line and keep Judaism alive. And he gets all nervous, but he tells him that's going to be your mission in life. 2.5 weeks later, 3 weeks later, the Rebbe passes away from typhus. And now there's a new Rebbe. He's got this mission from his father. And he sees in the years to come, this is what happens to Lenin, this is what happens to Stalin, this is what happens to Trotsky. And what happens is, now we're faced with the dilemma of what to do. Communism is trying to destroy Judaism. So the great Rosh yeshivas, and I understand they had historical precedent, they say, listen, we got to save the yeshivas, and they leave Russia, including the Holy Chafetz Chaim, who regrets it later in his life. The Rebbe says, I'm staying. I'm not giving up on Russian Jewry. They take the example of Yavne v'Chachamea. We have to save the learning of Torah. The previous rabbi disagrees with him, and he says, "No, I'm staying here." He creates a secret network that keeps Judaism alive with yeshivas and schools and mikvahs and synagogues until the fall of the Soviet Union. All of this system that he brings it comes in 1927, comes to head when he's arrested, sentenced to death, eventually freed, and he goes to Western Europe. And now he faces a new dilemma: how to bring Hasidic life to Western Europe. And in those years between 1927 and 1939, he builds a system of yeshivas, which is transformational. And in 1929, 1930, he comes to the United States and spends almost a year here. He wants to reinvigorate the Hasidic community. He wants to raise money to help Russian Jewry. He travels around the country, he meets even the president of the United States. And he comes back, but he says, I'm staying in Russia. And then when the war breaks out, there's a collaboration between the American government and the Russian government and the German government. Save the Rebbe. So the Germans are working with the Americans. They're not in the war yet. September 1939, they're not into December 1941. And the Germans think if we can save this rabbi, maybe the Americans are going to be nice to us. So he's able to escape. He comes to America and then becomes the next revolutionary moment. He gets off the boat and he says, America is nicht anders. America is not different. Judaism is going to flourish in this country like in Europe. And I heard this beautiful quote. There was a Rabbi Herschel Fogelman. At that time, he was a student in Torah Vodaas. Now, Torah Vodaas was the mother yeshiva of America. It was really the first major yeshiva in this country. And he was a student there. And he said, he portrayed it to me like this. He says, we, the few religious Jews, felt like the pioneers in the wagon train, trying to go to Oregon or California, and we're surrounded by the Indians. We're holding on for dear life. Imagine the image of sitting in the wagon train and the Indians running around in circles. They want to kill you. We're just holding on because traditional Judaism, Orthodoxy at that point, there was no great yeshivas yet in America. There was some. There was Torah Vodaas. There was Mesivtas Chaim Berlin. But the mentality of Orthodox Jews at that time was we're holding on for dear life. And he says the Rebbe came like the cavalry, but he didn't want to just chase off the Indians. He wanted to conquer the whole continent. He comes with a different kind of agenda. And then after the war, and with this I'll finish, as Hasidim escape Russia in a remarkable story that I write about in the book, where 1,000 Hasidim leave Russia on false passports, and the students come from Shanghai. Instead of saying to them, okay, guys, boys and girls, you're going to come live in Brooklyn or live in Israel, he sends them around the world to lay the foundation for a global Jewish renaissance that we've seen evolved in the generations. And on top of all of this, he's sick. He has serious medical challenges. He's in a wheelchair in the last 20 years of his life. He also takes the Rebbe and he's mentoring the Rebbe for his position of leadership later on. When you get into the guts of this story, it's a remarkable story of overcoming difficulties and challenges and hardship. It's really a phenomenal drama. You could make a 10-part Netflix drama about it, and people would be on the edge of their chairs.
Okay, so I want to transition now to the ideological positions that are most relevant to this podcast, of course, which is ideas of Zionism and Chabad's approach within the constellation of, call it Haredi Judaism, broadly speaking. When did you first begin, learning and thinking about Chabad's approach?
I've been thinking about it for a long time. Because I was asked to join the board of directors of the Jewish Agency, the board of governors Jewish Agency, I really, and the tension of this relationship is the ultimate Zionist institution. So I want to give you the little history to understand the position because it's very intriguing. The earliest Zionist group, one of the earliest Zionist groups in Russia was a group called Bilu. Any people who know anything about Zionist history know Bilu. Bilu, in starting the early 1880s, wanted to organize immigration to Israel and did so successful. Bilu is from the pasuk, the verse in Isaiah, Bet Yaakov l'chu v'necha, the house of Jacob, let us go out. So at that time, they came to the fourth Chabad Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, who passed away in 1883. And they say to him, will you join us? And he said to them, the whole pasuk is, the whole verse in the Torah is, Bet Yaakov l'chu v'necha ba'or Hashem, the house of Jacob, let us go out in the light of God. He says, add that element and I'll join you. And they tell him, forget it, because this is the battle over the new Jew. We want to create a new Jew where the foundations of Jewish identity are not Torah, not Jewish tradition, but we're creating the new Zionist nationalistic Jew. So he said to his son, if only they would have agreed, I would have moved to Israel, Eretz Yisrael, with 100,000 Hasidim. This is the beginning of the theological split. Now, his son, Reb Shalom Daber, the fifth Rebbe, was very articulate and strong against Zionism because he said Zionism is a replacement ideology that instead of the foundation of Judaism being Torah, it's secular nationalism. And we see this in whole generations. And the previous Rebbe continued with this approach throughout and said that he was very critical of Zionism, and that he was also very much involved with the famous story of the children of Tehran, which in 1943, the Ger Rebbe turns to the previous Rebbe and says, "You got to help." And he's in touch with Rav Herzog, who had great respect for, and basically organizes he threatens to orchestrate a boycott of the Jewish Agency and other Jewish charities unless they begin to allow these children to live in a better environment. So he's very critical of this. But the interesting thing him is what happens in 1947, 47 and 48. The state of Israel evolves. And what I write in the book is that there's three responses in the Orthodox world, and this is a generalization, to the establishment of the state. On one end, we have the Haredi community, personified by the Chazon Ish, the famous story of him meeting together with Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion says to him, he wants to try to work things out with him. And the Chazon Ish tells him, listen, there's a story in the Talmud about two camels that come two sides of a bridge. One is laden with all kinds of material, merchandise, and the other is empty. And the one that's empty has to give way to the one that's full. He says, we have thousands of years of tradition. You have nothing. You have to give away to our point of view. So the Haredi community looks around and says, look at, everybody had a brother or a sister or a cousin that had left, traditional Jewish observance, and they had become very enamored with Zionism. My wife's grandfather was a frum Jew with a beard in Tel Aviv, and none of his children continued in that approach. They all became enamored. So Zionism becomes this foundation for creating the new Jew, and the Haredi world says we're going to create a society within a society which is separate. That's their response. On the flip side, we see the religious Zionist world based on the teachings of Rav Kook. And they say, number one, we don't agree with everything going on in secular Zionism. We're going to change that. We believe the state is Reshit Smichut Gulatenu, the first statement of redemption of the Jewish people. And we celebrating the establishment of the state. We're going to say Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut. This is a remarkable moment. And listen, let's be very honest. We have to stand in awe of that community because they've sacrificed more since October 7th than any segment of Israeli society. But on the flip side, they say the state is holy. We want to be taken. Now comes the previous Rebbe, and he takes a middle position. And he says, listen, till this point, he has very strong reservations about Zionism, and he still has them. But he says, I don't agree with the approach of the Chazon Ish, and I don't agree with the approach of the religious Zionists. Number one, we want to be active members of the society. And when there's a suggestion that the Chabad town in Israel should be located up in Meron. Meron is a small little village in the north, famous for the burial site of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the greatest Talmudic sages. And they say, hey, you know what? You should be next to Meron. And he says, no, I want to be next to Tel Aviv. And Kfar Chabad is established in the outskirts of Tel Aviv because I want to influence the society. Then he tells his Hasidim that Then he comes with the Chassidim and he says, listen, they ask him, we go to the army? And he says, yes, everybody should share in the responsibility of defending the country. Then he also tells them that he wants people to work. He takes a different view of spending a life in scholarship, which is a view in the Lithuanian yeshiva world. Not that there is great value to there is, but he says, go to yeshiva, get married, etc. But eventually you have to go out to work. It's so interesting when there's a group of Chabad refugees in France in 1947 because they had got it out of Russia, and the JDC, had supported them very beautifully. He sends them a letter. He says, that's great that they helped you out. Everybody's got to get a job. Either become a rabbi, become a teacher, start a business, go get a job. You should not be living on charity. It was good for a while. I want you to be self-sufficient. So he wants his Chassidim to be financially self-sufficient. And he wants them to take responsibility to bring Judaism to the broader society. And the final element is he wants Chabad to be non-political. So while all the other religious groups, Aguda establishes, eventually we have Shas and Aguda and Degel HaTorah, all the Haredi groups, and we have the Mavdal, the National Religious Party, and today it's a new reincarnation. So all of the religious groups in Israel create political parties to advance their cause. Chabad says, we're a non-political entity. People will vote as individuals for who they want to vote for, basically for the right wing and religious parties, because that's where their hearts are. But we are not endorsing any party for political office. We're not a political entity. We have responsibility as citizens to vote, but we're not going to have a political party. So Chabad strikes this middle ground. It doesn't endorse this concept in Zionism that the state is the end all and Mashiach is here. But it doesn't agree with the Chazon Ish, who says we're going to separate ourselves and build a society within a society. And it doesn't agree with the religious Zionist world, which says we're going to become fully integrated and embrace everything about the country. It's a nuanced middle view.
Now, this was the Friedrich's approach. How, if at all, did that perspective evolve over time? And the seventh Lubavitch Rebbe, what was his approach? Did he make any shifts there?
The one thing about the seventh Rebbe, they said the Friedrich Rebbe had one chassid, it was the seventh Rebbe. And we see something very interesting. Is, for instance, in 1952, I forgot the name of the guy, there was a European car maker that wanted to come to Israel. And there was a Jewish investor who was given this opportunity. And he didn't know what to do. And his family his mother had told him once, if you have a question in life, you don't know what to do, go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He goes to the Rebbe in 1952-53. And he says, should I make the car industry in Israel? And the Rebbe says to him, a car industry is very important because there's so many different parts that it can be transformational in all of industry in Israel. You should definitely do it. And we see that the Rebbe, throughout his history of time as Rebbe, he met with 6 or 7 of the Israeli prime ministers, 5 or 6 of the presidents. And these meetings were different. Many distinguished Rosh Yeshivas meet with prime ministers and presidents, but a lot of times it's about, what can you do to help my yeshiva? And the Rebbe was always, what can I do to help your country? And the Rebbe took very strong views on the issues of Israel's security, that they shouldn't compromise that security. At the same time, he did not endorse secular Zionism as the end all for the Jewish people. So we're struggling with this idea of secular Zionism. We want to be active members of the society, but at the same time, we realize that Mashiach hasn't come, and this is not the utopian Jewish existence. So it's a kind of middle ground between the ardent Zionism of the religious of the Dati Leumi community, the rejection of interaction with modern Israeli society by the Haredi world. And it's really interesting. We had this big demonstration for Israel in Israel recently against the draft. And the Chabad Rabbinical Court put out a letter in support of the demonstration. And in the letter it says, interestingly enough, because we believe in the idea of Jewish learning, and we also had an agreement with the army that was canceled by the Supreme Court's, in my opinion, unbelievable ruling that just basically invalidated everything. And in the letter, it says that even though we believe that you can go to the army after you learn in yeshiva and after you completed your studies, we still agree with this idea that we need that the present way the Supreme Court is addressing this thing is not good, and there has to be some kind of legislations. So that in the letter from the Chabad Rabbinical Court in Israel, it's two sides. We support the demonstration because we believe in the value of Jewish learning, but we have a different view about going to the army. So this is, again, Chabad's position. And by the way, I think this challenges the Haredi world and makes a certain discomfort because I think we're about as religious and careful with Challah Yisrael pizza as anybody else. So, and that, in a sense, challenges, it comes to a much deeper issue about how do we deal with modernity and how do we live in the world around us and how are we part of the society. And I think it's also rooted in the teachings of Hasidic philosophy and Hasidus, which teaches us that we can bring holiness and sanctity to any place. I mean, there's more to this on a theological level. And so there's a worldview here in Chabad, which is distinctly different. We are part of the Haredi community, but we have a disagreement with a lot of the Haredi community.
What's interesting is that from my understanding, the Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, he did not, generally speaking, encourage Aliyah, at least certainly not on a mass scale. I mean, you can imagine, right, the way that he was revered. He could have proclaimed, okay, all of my followers are moving, and you could have had 200,000, whatever the number would be, a very, very significant number in Israel.
No, he did not encourage Aliyah on a mass scale. And also, he was very concerned that Jewish leaders have responsibility to stay in their communities. At the same time, I think, interestingly enough, that the Rebbe must have been a cause of much more Aliyah than almost anybody else. Why? Because he emboldened their Jewish identity. Through the actions of the Rebbe and his shluchim and his emissaries, so many more Jews became connected to Israel and connected to Judaism. And the next step of being connected to Judaism is that decision, you know what, I want to be in Israel. And I think if you tap on the shoulders of many of, especially American Olim, and you'll ask them, tell me your story of Jewish identity. They're going to tell you about that Chabad moment that was transformational to them. There's a very beautiful story that after the fall of the Soviet Union, at the time the prime minister was Arik Sharon, and he was very angry at Chabad because Chabad began building a system of Jewish education in Russia. And he calls the chief rabbi of Russia, Rabbi Beryl Lazar. He told me the story. And his biggest financial supporter, Levi Levayev, was a very big businessman in Israel, a tycoon here. And he calls him for a meeting. And he starts yelling at them, what are you doing? You're making Jewish schools, and you're making yeshivas, and you're building synagogues. We want everybody to come to Israel. So they tell him, listen, the Jews know nothing about Judaism, and they're not going to come to Israel unless they learn about Judaism. So what do you want from us? We're going to cause more aliyah. So this was and he cusses them out, basically degrades them in the office of the prime minister. He called Lazar from Russia to come to this meeting. A year or two later, he goes to Russia, and they bring in this choir from some town, I think where his family came from. And Sharon begins to cry. And he says, you guys were right and I was wrong. Because when you build up Jewish identity, automatically it's going to cause people to want to make aliyah. But aliyah, mass aliyah, the Rebbe also felt that there needs to be strong Jewish communities in the diaspora, and Jewish leaders. He encouraged many people to move to Israel, but as a rule, he discouraged Jewish leaders because they have responsibility toward their communities.
Within Chabad, what is the standard approach to going to the army and integrating in that way?
Well, what happens is most people will sit and learn yeshiva for a few years. Some of them will go to kollel for a year or two, and then they'll go to the army.
To what age are we talking?
Till about 22, 23 usually. And I mean, a kollel in Chabad is usually 1 year, maybe two, and that's it. It's unless you're an outstanding Talmid Chacham. Again, this is where we have a different view than the Litvish world, which is encouraging lifelong learning. And we believe very much that people have to make a living and they have to go out and earn a livelihood. If you want to be a shliach and join the Chabad network is wonderful. But if not, you need to stand on your own feet economically. And this was a different approach. And there is people that do spend a long time in learning, but they're, really outstanding scholars. The great majority of people, and we have many friends of mine here in Israel I was Friday night at a friend of mine's house, and his son says to me, I just came back from Miluim. How long you were there? He was in the army for over 150 days. And we've lost, I would say, probably around a dozen Chabad soldiers since the beginning of the war.
So would you say that the average Chabad young man, let's say, again, lives in Kfar Chabad or wherever it might be, is at the age of 22 or 23 going to the army? And if so, are they doing a full service? Are they doing it within a certain framework?
It depends on the army. A lot of time by then they're married, they have a kid, and a lot of times they're going to go in for a shorter period, and some for a longer period. It's whatever works out with them in the army. But what we do see, I once had a little bit of a harsh conversation with some really sweet boys I think they were from Brisk or me, I forgot where they were from, at the Kotel. We were discussing this very issue. And I said to them, Chabad, we have an arrangement. This is what happens. I'm not saying everybody does this, but a lot, this has been the approach. The guys go to yeshiva, and then they spend a year in kollel, and then, they begin to look for a job, and you end up being drafted to go to the army. We also had an arrangement in the army that was invalidated by the Supreme Court where the boys could spend a year in New York in that special, unique environment in 770 in the Rebbe Shul. Even now, it's still a remarkable spiritual oasis, and the young boys want to be there for a period of time.
Before they would go to the army, that's the idea?
Before, yeah, we had for the last 20, 25 years, before that this system has been going on since at least 50 years, where the army permitted the boys to go to New York for a year before service. So this approach was like a kind of balanced kind of approach. We stressed the idea of spending time in yeshiva, and this was a compromise. And I tell secular Israelis, I say, listen, we want somebody to have a foundation in Jewish learning. We want to work on building up their identity as a Jew. We want them to spend time in yeshiva. That's very, very important to us. And later on is when you're going to do this. But deeper than this is the willingness to engage the society around you. And I want to tell you that I think there's two foundational points here we need to understand. If you go into a Litvish yeshiva, the common language of culture is they tell you you're going to become a great Torah scholar. The greatest praise in a Chabad yeshiva is not that. It's have you become what's called a pnimistic yid? Have you internalized the values of Judaism into who you are? And in Chabad, there's this tremendous effort of each person struggling and working to really integrate to the very core of their being these spiritual values of connection to Hashem, of love of Hashem, of fear of Hashem, and to really be connected. And Hasidic philosophy spends a lot of times dealing with the spiritual kind of world. What is free choice and what is good and what is evil? Why are we here in this world? There's a lot more conversation about these kinds of spiritual issues. And there's a big focus on davening and prayer and internalizing ideas. So the first thing is we want people to be really what we call pnimistic Yidden. Jews have internalized Judaism. No matter where they are, they're going to be that kind of person. The second thing is Hasidic philosophy, and I mentioned this before, believes that we can bring kedusha, holiness, everywhere in the world. We're not just, we want to bring the sense of holiness into the world, and we have a responsibility for every Jew in the world. So when you bring these factors together, it causes a different kind of worldview about how we're going to deal with the society around us. We're not afraid of dealing with people who differ than us, because if you are comfortable, if you've internalized Yiddishkeit, if you've internalized the values of Torah, if you've internalized the ideals of what it means to be a chassid, then if somebody doesn't agree with you, you can handle it. And there's a very interesting statistic that I'll share with you. Some years ago, I did a study only of California. We have a concept in the Orthodox world called OTD. It means off the derech. People become not religious. I don't know what the exact stats are, but I would imagine in the Chabad community it's 7, 8, 9%. In the more modern Orthodox community, it's 10, 15%. I did at the time a study of all of the all of the adult children of Chabad Shluchim in California, and the rate of OTD, of people who are not Shabbos observant, is less than 1%. In other words, the children who are being brought up in isolated Jewish communities, far from Orthodox world, and they had to internalize Judaism because every single day of their life they faced people who didn't agree with them. Their Shabbos table was not another yeshiva bacher, it was some college student that fell in, or some liberal Jew that decided he's going to spend a Friday night with the local rabbi. They're dealing with all different kinds of people, and their drop-off rate from religious observance is lower than any other segment of the Jewish world, of the Orthodox world. I find that to be and where's that coming from? Because these kids are comfortable dealing with the world around us, and they've learned the Hasidic teachings of internalization, of spiritual values to the point it becomes the core of their identity in a true way.
I'm going to circle back. Is this what you told the Bachrim at the Kotel?
So I told the Bachrim at the Kotel something else, a little harsher. And let me tell you what I told them. They said to me, you can't do that. Their Judaism will be endangered. So I said to them something a little harsh. I said, Oy vey, you spent 4 years in Mesivta, that's high school. You spent 5 years in yeshiva. You're married, and you're sitting 2 years in kollel, and you got a kid. I didn't say you got a mother-in-law, but you got a mother-in-law. And your Yiddishkeit is going to fall apart because you go to the army. I said, Oy vey for that kind of Yiddishkeit. That means it shows that your Judaism is very weak. And my argument would be, is that the traditional Orthodox Haredi world built a model of fortress Judaism because they saw the tremendous losses that happened in the Orthodox world, especially if you go back into the mid-20th century. As I heard that the students of Yeshivas Eitz Chaim in Yerushalayim in 1950, hardly anybody remained religious. But I think and I think that reaction, even though it wasn't the Chabad reaction, I understand it. But I think it's also the world has changed today. And I think that you need to equip young people with the ability. So we have this debate with the yeshiva world that we're willing to have a broader interaction with the broader world. And we're not taking what I call in this book the view of fortress Judaism. And we're willing to engage the broader world within certain kinds of conditions and parameters. I'm not saying there isn't effects within the Chabad community because of that. Nothing is utopian, and we happen to realize that. But at the same time, I think it's a different approach to dealing with opportunity and freedom that we all face today. Thank God in America that we're living in such a country which gives such freedom and opportunity to Jews that we've never seen in history.
I want to ask you just an interesting question, just because I was speaking with the Shaliach recently, and he mentioned to me that you talked about the idea that Chabad has maintained an apolitical position, which I hear. He mentioned that at a Chabad house you'll never find an Israeli flag, and you'll never hear at an event the singing of Hatikva. And I'm curious, is that described as a political act? Is that described as a identitarian? What exactly is the thinking behind that?
No, it's really what it is a discomfort with symbols of secular nationalism. Interestingly enough, It's a discomfort with symbols of secular nationalism, which are replacing Jewish identity. But there's a very interesting statistic that I'll share with you, which I was shocked to hear. The Jewish Federations of North America just did a study about attitudes of American Jews. And it came out like this, that 32% of Jews who attend Reform temples call themselves Zionists. 55% who go to conservative, 65 who go to Orthodox, and 82% of people who go to Chabad consider themselves Zionists. So here we are, we're uncomfortable with this kind of secular nationalism replacing Jewish identity, but because we're teaching people of the connection to Eretz Yisrael, which is foundational principle in Jewish belief and in the Torah, it's causing more people to be supportive of Israel than any other segment of the Jewish world. And you know as well as I do that the great majority of people walking in Chabad centers today are not themselves personally Orthodox or observant. But we are fostering with them a greater commitment to Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, what brings about that commitment? Is it going to be the symbol? And a tikva, listen, there's another story. I mean, Rav Kook had another version of a tikva that he wanted to have that was more rooted in a deeper spiritual statement. So we're uncomfortable with symbols of secular nationalism, which, so to speak, are there to say we don't want Torah is being pushed aside and we have new things. But at the same time, we're supporting the security of the country. We are encouraging Jews who that's their right destiny to go to Israel. We are going to the army and we're dying for the country. And we're active partners in Israeli society. So Israeli diplomats know one thing, that when it comes to organize the Jewish community support of Israel, there's one group they can always count on. It's Chabad, because we're going to be there for them. And even though I may have a discomfort with secular nationalism, they know very well that we're going to be the ones that are going to be supportive of
Just
the
in
country.
closing, given the fault lines that do exist within today's Orthodox world, and I do believe actually that in recent years there has been a softening of positions and a sort of uh, a bit of a, I don't know, a coming together among different aspects of the Orthodox community. With Chabad and the Litvisher world, I think there's been less aggressive rhetoric and more collaboration in recent years. I don't know if you agree with that assessment or not.
I agree with you 100%.
Certainly, you're a personal example of that, but I think it's happening more broadly. But I'm curious, do you think that there is a way that the Chabad approach can or will have a broader impact on the larger Haredi world with respect to these questions of Zionism?
I think it can, but I think that's the challenge. And I think the Haredi world looks at us, and the discomfort is that we have a different solution to the problem of modernity. And their reaction a lot of times, that's Chabad, they're different. You've heard the line. But I think deep down, I think we are raising questions that are very, very central and very important. And there is this kind of change, and I think it's because of a lot of reasons. There's been a mellowing of the theological positions. I think there's a much greater appreciation in the Lithuanian world today of Hasidic teachings and of the Rebbe's Torah, etc. I think stories about Shalom Mordechai Rabashkin, where the Litvisher world stood up for Shalom Mordechai in a way that was just magnificent, in a real phenomenal kind of way. And I think the fact that Litvisher people are traveling around, and when they get to the Cayman Islands and they meet a shliach and they see that the kid hasn't had ice cream for a couple of months because there's no Chal B'Yisrael, and they see the Yerushalayim is real and that the commitment to Yiddishkeit is real, I think it develops with them a certain kind of respect that they didn't have before. All of these different varied reasons are, I think, very, very important.
Do you think that's happening in reverse as well, by the way?
I think so also because what automatically is that we're seeing a less rhetoric out of the literature world toward us. I think it depends. I think I've learned to appreciate many things in the literature world. Like I get Mishpacha magazine every week. Now, sometimes it drives me a little bit crazy, but at the same time, I see many things there that are wonderful things to be emulated. And one of the teachings of the Rebbe was that we have to look at other people and see the value in what they do, even if they're taking a little bit different approach. So I, it's, I think as things have mellowed, there's been a greater, and I've met many people in the literature world who are very fine Ehrlich Yidden, who do things with great Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. And maybe I'm in a little bit of a privileged position because I met a lot of the people who are in the leadership, like the leadership of Gudish Israel, which has some very fine people, standing in the top tier of their leadership. So I've been privileged to be friends with some of those people over the years and collaborate with them on important issues for the sake of Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people. Again, our term Klal Yisrael is not the people who live in Borough Park in Brooklyn. Our term of Klal Yisrael is the Jews who live in Montana. We have a different kind of lexicon, so to speak. But nevertheless, I think that this is a process going on, and I think it's a very big change. I mean, the the cherem of the Gra has been long forgotten. And, the famous story is, the Alter Rebbe came to the Gra, and the Gra didn't see him. If he would have saw him, we'd all be living happily ever after. But I think a lot of it has mellowed out in a lot of ways, and I think it's a very important thing. And there's nothing wrong with this kind of conversation across the different segments of the Orthodox world about what are the best solutions to how we deal with this. Dealing with modernity is a very big challenge for us. And coming to terms with freedom and opportunity is profound. Reb Shimshon Rav Hirsch had his approach in Germany. We have an approach which is a little bit different. The Litvischer approach took a third approach. And I actually lay out in this new book, I contrast what the Litvischer Gedolim did in the 1920s and the 1940s to what the previous Rebbe did. The previous Rebbe said, I'm taking responsibility for all Jews. They went and they said, we're going to go build Rav Aaron Kotler says, I'm going to build a yeshiva in Lakewood. Did he succeed? Without question. In my community of Orange County, is it relevant? Also, absolutely not. Almost nobody knows who it is. So on one level, it's a massive success. On another level, it was a different strategy for Jewish survival. So did it succeed? Yes. It created the greatest center, greatest, and probably in the history of Jewish people, more people sitting and learning Torah. Maybe if I'm Surah and Popadisa, I don't know how many people were sitting in yeshiva then. On the flip side, people in Lakewood think it has a very big impact. Come to Orange County, California, where I live, and hardly anybody knows what it is. So I'm in awe when I see, a Siyum Hashas in a sports stadium. But at the same time, there's different strategies here. And there's nothing wrong with this conversation. And I tried to be very careful in the book to show the different strategies that the previous Rebbe had in Russia and in America, and what the Litvischer Gedolim had. And they were honestly very different strategies. And each one of them succeeded in their own way. And there's nothing wrong with having a conversation about those differences as long as done with dignity and respect.
I think it's very interesting to look at these different models. And I think part of the challenge in sort of the Litvischer world borrowing from Chabad, if you will, and especially with respect to the questions of integration into Israeli society, is that, Chabad and the Dati Leumi world share something in common, which is a educational and socialization from the youngest age of certain ideals. And therefore, this approach of, let's say, interactivity and exposure and so forth is able to succeed because it's built from the very beginning. Whereas if you live in a world in which, like these Bachrim you spoke to at the Kotel, where what you're telling them has not been socialized since their mother's milk. And so to now, at this age of 23, 25, whatever it might be, to shift over to a different mentality is very, very difficult. And so in order to create these solutions, you really are basically re-engineering the entire upbringing, the entire ethos of the childhood.
Right. And we're also challenging some of the solutions of the Gedolim of the Litvischer world and saying, well, we had a different solution. And that, for a lot of people, makes people uncomfortable. Just like if somebody came to me and says, well, I disagree with what the Lubavitcher Rebbe did. So it's understandable there's this level of discomfort. And I get it. And you're right, it is from the mother's milk. A little kid in Chabad Cheder starts every Yid possesses in the Neshama as 2 years old, And the Rebbe's first line when he accepted the leadership of Chabad in 1951, he said that in Judaism there's three loves. There's Avos HaTorah, the love of Torah, Avos Hashem, the love of God, and Avos Yisrael. And then he said, if you have the first two and you're missing the three, something's wrong with your Avos Hashem and Avos HaTorah. In other words, he laid out as a foundation a different vision in modern times where the idea of loving your fellow Jew, the one who's very different from you, is foundational in your Avodas Hashem and your Avodas and your Limud Torah. It's a whole different mindset. And I think there's a trickle-down effect because I think there's also in the Litvischer world a greater admiration, as I told you, as a Lisi Chabad people. They are Yerushalayim. Their children are being brought up. I have a grandson who's a Baki in Shas. He's mamish abaki and shas. It's amazing. And I have other grandchildren. You look at their Yerushalayim and where they brought up. It's just, to me, I'm amazed. And today, we have our own challenges because we are educating children without having the Rebbe here with us. So you're educating them on the Rebbe's ideas, which are powerful. which are very vibrant and very dynamic, and that's having a very big impact on them. So we have our own kind of challenges together, how we're going to do things. Listen, this kind of conversation I think is very healthy because I think it's very important that different parts of the Jewish world is talking to each other, and we're having this conversation.
Amen. And Mirza Hashem, it should be something which leads to inspiration for others to find solutions.
I just want to mention one more thing. Undaunted is already on sale on Amazon. It's Baruch Hashem doing, it's just, the publication date is November 4th, but it's already, pre-sales are going through the roof. And I'm going to be spending time on a book tour talking about it. And I think it'll be a very interesting read for people to understand about the remarkable contributions of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And I consider him one of the most consequential leaders of Judaism in the 20th century. And I think people were intrigued to understand his story. And even if they don't agree with all of his approaches, I think it's important to understand how he tackled the challenges of modern Jewish life in Tsarist Russia, in communism, in Europe, and in America, in a variety of different paradigms. He emerges as one of the most interesting leaders and consequential leaders of 20th century Jewry.
Rabbi David Eliezeri, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.